Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all for this important session, which is named Community System Strengthening Equals to Sustainable HIV Response. My name is Ivan Vorontsov. I'm working as a Sustainability and Transition Advisor in the Eurasian Harm Reduction Association in Lithuania, and I'm co-chairing this session with my colleague.
Namaste, my name is Simran Sheikh, and I'm a transgender activist from India, New Delhi.
Thank you. And just to say a few words about the topic we will be speaking today, we all know that communities, they play a vital role in the response to HIV epidemic, and not only in delivering and improving the quality of services, but also in advocating for their sustainability and for the introduction of the required policies at local and national levels. And sustained and effective response to the epidemic requires strengthening of the systems of key affected communities and of the community of people living with AIDS, especially if we're talking about those countries where we have concentrated the epidemic among key affected populations, and where the representatives of such communities they are often much more stigmatized, socially isolated, and even criminalized. So their community systems require increased financial and technical support in order for them to realize their potential contribution to improved health outcomes, and this is what we will be speaking today. And we have 6 brilliant speakers today with us on the panel. It's Svetlana Radchenko from Kyrgyzstan, Robin Dayton from the United States of America, Richard Elliot from Canada, Marlon Thompson from Jamaica, Madhusudana Batala from India, and the last but not the least, Diana Kerrigan from the United States. So I will suggest we proceed, to save time, we proceed now to the presentations, and also we suggest that we go through all presentations, and we'll leave some space at the end of the session for questions and answers.
So without wasting any further time, let me please welcome Svetlana Radchenko from Kyrgyzstan. She has been working with TI Plus since 2007 as an outreach worker, and additionally as a paralegal individual during last 2 years. She is from the sex worker community, and she enjoys monitoring the community by TI Plus to transfer their experience of community empowerment to HIV services NGO in her country. Ladies and gentlemen, Svetlana Radchenko.
And Svetlana, she will speak in Russian, but she will be translated into English, and the slides will be in English.
Он работает? Подожди. Всем добрый день. Я очень рада приветствовать вас на конференции ВИЧ-СПИДу. И хотела бы представить свой доклад «Мониторинг силами сообщества».
Good afternoon to all. I'm very happy to welcome you at the AIDS conference. The title of my presentation is Community-Based Monitoring of HIV Programs.
Итак, ТАИС Плюс – это общинная организация, созданная по инициативе и на средства секс-работников. Наша миссия – это усиление сообществ секс-работников с тем, чтобы достичь более достойных условий жизни, труда и секс-работников.
TAIS Plus is a sex worker-led organization which was created by sex workers for sex workers. Our mission is to strengthen the sex worker community in order to achieve more decent working and living conditions for sex workers.
Инициативная группа была создана самими секс-работниками в 1997 году, но официально была зарегистрирована в 2000 году 3 марта. 3 марта это будущий Международный день прав секс-работников, который отмечают с 2001 года после фестиваля секс-работников в Индии.
So at first we had just an initiative group, an informal group which got formally registered on March 3rd, 2000. And March 3rd later became one of the International Sex Workers' Rights Day and after the Indian Sex Workers Festival.
Эта фотография ассоциируется с самими сотрудниками ТАИС+, и как они себя видят. Это было в прошлом году на летней школе.
So this is a picture which was created by the staff members of TAIS Plus last year during the summer school, and it represents their ideas about what TAIS Plus means for them.
Мониторинг силами сообщества. Период с 2016 и по 2017 год все области страны, где есть программы профилактики ВИЧ секс-работников. Поддержка была ПРООН, проект глобального фонда, компонент усиления сообщества и преодоления правовых барьеров. И было СВАН проект Руби Такара.
So now let's go to community-based monitoring. The community-based monitoring took place in 2016-2017 in all regions of the country where we had HIV prevention program. The community-based monitoring was supported on the one hand by the Global Fund project and on the other hand by the Robert Carr Fund supported project which was run through SWAN regional network.
Мониторинг через очки СВИД. Это планирование, выполнение и мониторинг программ по ВИЧ и ПП секс-работники должен быть основан на СВИД.
So we believe that monitoring should be approached through the lens of SWID. It's a sex worker implementation tool, and we believe that planning, implementing, and monitoring of HIV/STI programs with sex workers should be based on SWID.
Цель мониторинга силами сообщества – это цель регулярно отслеживать качество услуг правовых барьеров, мешающих секс-работникам принимать участие в программе по ВИЧ и включая мониторинг. Секс-работники, клиенты или партнеры нашей программы. Какой разрыв существует между тем, что предлагают программы, и тем, что нужно секс-работникам? Это дружественные государственные учреждения, расширение участия сообщества секс-работников в программах по ВИЧ и прав. Это мониторинг на местах, сопровождающий технической помощи сотрудников НПО.
So what was the goal of community-based monitoring? We wanted to regularly monitor the quality of services and existing legal barriers that prevent sex workers from accessing services. More specifically, we were interested in finding out, are sex workers clients or partners of the programs? Is there a gap between what sex workers need and what is being offered to them? Are the facilities friendly to sex workers? And do sex workers meaningfully participate in HIV and human rights programs?
Инструменты мониторинга. Были разработаны опросники для оценки и мониторинга, возможности НПО расширять участие секс-работников в программ по ВИЧ и работать с правовыми барьерами. Это качество ДКТ и качество ИПП-сервиса.
So we developed a number of instruments to monitor the following. Do NGOs give opportunity to sex workers to participate in HIV program? We monitored, with the help of these questionnaires, we monitored the quality of VCT, and we also monitored the quality of STI services.
Техническая помощь. Фокус усиления сообщества, адаптированный раздел номер 1 СВИД, расширение возможностей и полномочий сообщества для обучения сотрудников НПО, цель как включить ежедневную работу в организации подход и усиление сообщества. Это анализ ежедневного общения с секс-работниками. Вы как пришли, чтобы рассказать о безопасном сексе? Или скажите, важно ли практиковать более безопасный секс и почему? Вместе искали ответы на вопросы. Нужно же изменить в нашей работе, чтобы секс-работники участвовали себя партнерами нашими программ.
So the monitoring wasn't just a check, it was also accompanied by technical assistance to those NGOs that we were monitoring. we were focusing during this technical assistance, we were focusing on community strengthening. Specifically, we were using the first chapter of Suite, which talks about community empowerment. And we were trying to achieve a great inclusion of sex workers into the programming. What we were also doing during these visits, we were analyzing the communication that programs have with sex workers to establish whether sex workers are clients or partners of the program.
Организация мониторинга. Каждый квартал в течение с 2016 и 2017 года сотрудники 6 НПО, которые работают с секс-работниками, для каждого визита разрабатывались план. Это техническое задание команды, это инструменты мониторинга, обучающие материалы для оказания технической помощи и формат отчета о визите.
The monitoring was conducted quarterly in 2016-2017, and there were 6 staff members of 6 NGOs that participated in the monitoring. For each monitoring visit, we prepared a set of documents which included visit plan, terms of reference, monitoring tools, training materials to provide technical support, and report template.
Каждый визит – это фокус-группы с сотрудниками НПО, техническая помощь с фокусом 1 в разделе «Усиление сообщества». Это встречи с секс-работниками, обсудить проблемы и отзывы о работе НПО, а также барьеры и возможность секс-работников, активно принимать участие в программах по ВИЧ-правам. Это выводы рекомендаций по итогам визита согласовывались НПО, а затем направлялись основным донорам, которые финансируют программы по ВИЧ-правам.
So what did each of the visits look like? First of all, there was a focus group discussion with the staff of the given NGO that was being monitored. Then we provided them technical support based on the Section 1 of Suite. Then we were meeting sex workers to discuss their daily problems. And at the end, we were coming up with conclusions and recommendations for the given NGO, which they had the right to approve and comment on. And later, those recommendations and findings were sent to donors.
Итоги. С 10 сотрудников ТАИС Плюс принимали участие в мониторинговых визитах в течение 2 лет. 8 из них делали это на волонтерской основе. В среднем 5 визитов за 2 года каждый из 6 НПО. 47 сотрудников из 6 НПО принимали участие в мониторинге, включая дискуссию в фокус-группах и в обучающих сессиях на рабочем месте.
So overall, 10 TAIS Plus staff were involved in monitoring. Over 2 years, we did at least 5 visits into each of the NGOs, and altogether there were 47 staff members of those NGOs participating in the focus groups.
Находки. ДКТ. Это необходимо улучшать качество предтестовое консультирование, права. Нужны тренинговые модули для того, чтобы говорить секс-работникам о правах и о том, как себя защищать самостоятельно. Это информационная работа. Печатные материалы почти никто не читает. Нужны новые форматы и видео, приложения для телефона. Усиление сообщества. Секс-работники чаще воспринимают только как клиенты программ, которым нужны услуги.
So what did we found as a result of those monitoring visits? First of all, we found out that we need to improve the quality of pre-test counseling. Secondly, we also discovered that we need some training modules in order to explain sex workers what their rights are. We also need to find alternative approaches to delivering information because we found out that almost nobody is prepared to read printed information. And finally, we need to do some community empowerment because sex workers are mainly perceived as clients and not as partners of programs.
Изменение ДКТ. Это предтестовое консультирование уже занимает 20-30 минут. Меньше страха, если придется объявлять ВИЧ положительный результат. Права. Появились первые руководства о том, как проводить встречи с секс-работниками на тему права поведения с милицией и самостоятельной защиты. Информационная работа. Первый видеоролик «Мы знаем свои права». И усиление сообщества. Сотрудники НПО из числа секс-работников хотят принимать участие в мониторинге силы сообщества.
So those findings were not just left out there. We did something based on them. First of all, we managed to improve the quality of pre-test counseling. It now takes 20 to 30 minutes compared to 5 minutes before. counselors are now less scared to announce results in case somebody tested HIV positive. When it comes to rights, we developed a training module to discuss human rights with sex workers. We also produced a video for sex workers called We Know Our Rights. And finally, NGO staff is willing to participate in community-based monitoring.
Выводы. Существует рост потенциала сотрудников ТАИС+, новые навыки, мониторинг, обучение, передача своего практического опыта, укрепление партнерских отношений с НПО. Мы стали лучше понимать друг друга. Сначала наши визиты воспринимались как проверка. Нам понадобилось время, чтобы с этим справиться. Мониторинг силами сообщества должен стать неотделимой частью программ по ВИЧ, и его результаты использоваться для планирования и укрепления программ. Необходимо обучить мониторингу сотрудников секс-работников, формировать смешанные мониторинговые команды.
So to conclude, I would like to point out that as a result of doing this community-based monitoring, we managed to significantly increase the capacity of TAIS Plus staff. We also managed to establish more friendly relationship with NGOs in the country, because at the beginning, when we just started our monitoring visits, they perceived us as somebody who came with control and checks, and later on we had a more trusting relationship established. We also believe that community-based monitoring should be an integral part of HIV programs. Finally, we believe that we need to train sex workers and form mixed monitoring groups so that sex workers would do monitoring together with NGO staff.
Это как раз последние фотографии, наш был последний выезд на юг. В первой фотографии, где приглашали секс-работников и сотрудников организации, проводили мониторинг силами сообщества на тему «Может ли ООН защитить свои права?». И это то же самое фотография, только это в городе Ош, где девушки работают и живут, и где они могут нас принимать. Там тоже проводилась тематическая встреча на тему «Может ли ООН защитить свои права?».
So these are two photos from our last monitoring visits that we did in the south of Kyrgyzstan in the city of Osh. And the first photo is a meeting with NGO staff, and the second meeting is a meeting with sex workers. So we basically meet sex workers where they work.
Всем большое спасибо.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Svetlana, for your very interesting presentation on the community-based monitoring of the services for sex workers in Kyrgyzstan. And I would like to ask the second speaker, Robin Dayton from United States of America, to the stage. Robin is a technical advisor with FHI 360 and the general advisor of the Linkages, a USAID PFR-funded project working with key populations in 30 countries. Robin is passionate about the intersection of social justice, gender equality, community engagement, and public health. Please, Robin.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see so many of you here as the conference winds down. And just as, thank you. Okay, I'm so happy to be here with you all. And it really is an honor to be with so many folks who are really committed to community leadership and human rights within key population programming. And it's particularly an honor to get to present something with co-authors that represent the 4 global key population networks, including Impact, the Innovative Response Globally for Trans Women and HIV, the Global Network of Sex Work Projects, and the International Network of People Who Use Drugs, as well as colleagues from the Alliance. And I do see co-authors here, and I'm so appreciative that you all were able to make it. So we work together on a technical advisory group, or a TAG, on violence, stigma, and discrimination against key populations. And based on TAG member experiences, we saw the need for guidance to international and regional actors like the UN, INGOs like ourselves, governments, embassies, donors, and global and regional key population networks on how to respond when situations go from bad to worse in locations where we're implementing HIV programs. And in this presentation, I hope to both convince you of the need for a strengthened response and also encourage you to take a look at this brief and act upon its recommendations and principles. So for many of us working with key populations, we see a lot of situations going from bad to worse. And headlines from Nigeria and Indonesia that were taken from newspapers this time last year, and our programs where we see outreach workers working with young men who have sex with men who are tortured and arrested, where we see sex workers abducted and forcibly disappeared, transgender women murdered, often in mob attacks, and people who inject drugs subjected to extrajudicial killings. And it is not that violence against key populations is new. Stigma and discrimination have long resulted in a disproportionate burden of abuse among these groups, but recently we've seen human rights violations increase in both their severity and their intensity, often in concert with broader attacks on civil society. And we find ourselves asking, what do I do? And for those of us here at this HIV-focused conference, we're asking, what do I do, not just as individuals who are witnessing rights violations against communities that we care about or are a part of. We're also asking, what do I do, because the programs that we seek to implement are severely limited by these rights violations, both on the prevention side, where we see a closure of drop-in centers, limited or no outreach, a lack of access to commodities where condoms and lubricant can't be carried out in the community, and on the treatment side, where referral systems fall apart when partners don't feel safe any longer providing services, when clinical and outreach staff are forced to leave and seek asylum, and of course, where clients don't feel comfortable coming in to pick up ARVs. And when these issues occur, local actors are the first responders on the ground, but in some cases, a request is made for help from international and regional stakeholders, and we need to be ready to provide that support when called upon. And international and regional actors have been providing that support. But reflecting with members of the TAG, often the answers that we come up with to the question of what do I do are not ideal. We see that there's a lack of clarity on who should do what, which limits effective coordination and makes information sharing and joint planning chaotic, and that often those in the community bear the burden of that chaos, where we're constantly asking for requests for updates. We know that local voices are not always those that are prioritized and at the forefront, and in some cases are not acknowledged at all. The headline that I just showed from Nigeria saying that 42 gay men were arrested wasn't actually accurate. Many of those gay men were actually transgender women. So thinking about how much we're able to be responsive to communities that we may not know are even experiencing violence. And we also know that even the most well-intentioned of interventions, such as providing funding for emergency response, can sometimes be implemented in a way that fractures communities. For example, when we provide funding to one partner instead of a collective that could allow a coalition to form. So it was clear that to answer this question of what do I do, that guidance would be useful. And that brief, which was shown at the beginning and was supported by the TAG, was developed in a process of interviews and a workshop with individuals, mostly CBO representatives, who experienced acute violence firsthand in places like Uganda, Tanzania, and the Philippines. This is the list of organizations involved in developing the brief, and certainly I will not read this to you, but just to note that the strength of the recommendations and the principles in the brief really come from the collective process that allowed all these organizations to share their experiences and expertise. Okay, so for the second half, I want to start to go through the recommendations and principles to answer that question of what do I do, both broadly and then with concrete examples. The first, and by far the most important, is deference to local communities. Whether international and regional actors should become engaged at all, what the nature of their involvement should look like, certainly whether or not they should reach out to international media to gain extra attention, should all be decided by those most impacted by either our actions or our inactions, which is those folks on the ground. Second, and this is a recommendation that we spent a lot of our time discussing in workshops in particular, is that we need to acknowledge and compensate those who are taking on the most risk, and that's our outreach workers, who are often those who are often the least paid, particularly in instances of acute violence, but also more broadly. which led us in that same workshop to develop a companion toolkit for implementers that can help implementers think through the security measures that they have in place now and think about those that they may want to add, even in situations of chronic violence, but also should acute violence occur. And then all of these are so important, and I'm really working to sell this brief, so there's some in the front. I hope you're going to grab some. But I really want to focus on the last 3 as well, because the first 7 are important all the time, but you could start to do them when acute violence occurs. 8, 9, and 10 you have to do in advance, basically now. So number 8 allows for strong local coordination among partners on the ground to ensure that there are community-led groups that have already decided how to work together, not that we try to help form coalitions on the ground after people have already had to go into hiding. Number 9 focuses then on preemptive organization of ourselves as international and regional actors so that we know how to coordinate, and that if something occurs, a local actor knows one person that they can reach out to that can then activate a broader collective to provide support. And finally, number 10, that recommends that we start now to create spaces where we're learning from those who've experienced acute violence and that we're able to monitor trends that might help us predict when the next acute violence will occur or even prevent that violence from occurring at all. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, all of these recommendations are firmly grounded in these 3 principles. The first, a proactive investment in do no harm is fundamental to the design and implementation of effective and ethical key population programs. And we say this a lot, but I think what this has come to mean, and this is what we heard from communities, is this has come to mean it's a reason for not getting involved at all. But do no harm is not passive, right? Sometimes inaction is appropriate, but do no harm also means that we're reminded of our obligation to one another proactively, that we're funding security long before acute violence occurs. The second is that the protection of human rights is vital to the effective control of the epidemic. And I know this is a message that we're all hearing, we're all saying to each other, but I think especially in the context of acute violence, we see that biomedical and behavioral interventions are likely to have limited to no impact when situations like this are occurring. And finally, responding to instances of acute violence is absolutely vital, but we have to do so in a way that is accompanied by a big picture view and efforts toward longer term change. While we have to respond immediately when acute violence occurs, we will always be putting out fires if we don't think about what's creating so much kindling to begin with: stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. And without addressing those root causes, we will never come to a time when crisis response becomes unnecessary. So in closing, what do I do? What do you do? Sticking with the status quo when addressing issues of acute violence means that we decide to anticipate confusion and poor security infrastructure each time acute violence occurs. This is not in line with either do no harm nor epidemic control. This presentation has repeatedly asked, what do I do? But it's our hope that within the recommendations and the principles and the explanation that we've provided here, that it becomes clear that the question is actually, what do we do? By working together as donors and INGOs, as UN agencies, human rights defenders, key population networks, and by taking the lead of those communities most impacted, we can respond more effectively to acute violence while we work to prevent it. So it's our hope that you will take this brief back with you and think about it within your respective organization so that you can answer, what do we do in response to acute violence? Thank you.
Thank you, Dayton. It was really very impactful. What do we do? And seriously, what do we do? It's a question to think right now. Or else, definitely, the situations are going to go from bad to worst. With that, let me invite our third speaker, Richard Elliot from Canada. He's a lawyer and a human rights advocate with Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network, executive director since 2007. Helps guide the organization research, education, litigation, and other advocacy domestically and internationally. has authored numerous reports and articles on the range of HIV-related legal and human rights issue, appears in media as an expert advocate, engages with policymakers at various levels. Before joining the legal network staff in 1999, he has worked as a civil litigator, has appeared before all levels of Ontario courts and Supreme Courts of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Richard Elliot.
Great. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation to be here. And in fact, I feel like a little bit of a fraud because it's actually the work led by my colleague Mikhail Golichenko that I'm presenting, but Mikhail couldn't be here. So I've stepped in to present it in his stead. So if I don't know a particular detail the way he might, please forgive me. What I wanted to share with you, what we wanted to share with you, is a specific experience of providing human rights and legal technical assistance to key populations in the Russian Federation and HIV projects that are engaging with those key populations for a couple of purposes. To empower key populations to engage in meaningful dialogue with governmental authorities in shaping the response to the epidemic, and to support key populations in claiming their rights and overcoming human rights barriers to important HIV and other health services. There are actually two parts that fit together in doing this work, and I'm going to lay them out briefly for you. And then I want to share with you some of the results of the monitoring and evaluation that we did of the project to see if we were in fact achieving what we had hoped to achieve when we set out. And I'm kind of excited to present this because I think it demonstrates quite nicely the added value of having this kind of human rights and legal technical assistance in the HIV response, because we're often hearing, will show us the evidence that human rights programs of various sorts work, and while in some cases we shouldn't have to demonstrate the evidence because human rights are important in and of themselves, it's also helpful to be able to show that they do strengthen our HIV response if we can. This slide looks a little intimidating. Trust me, I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The point is simply to say that the first piece of this puzzle is a 3 and then close to 4-year program of activities that was being funded in Russia by the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria before, of course, the transition period began. And the point here is simply to show that key populations were organized themselves along the lines of here in particular people who use drugs, sex workers, MSM, and people living with HIV. And they all form part of a coordinating committee that was basically the non-governmental recipient of the Global Fund program money to be carried out in Russia. So this is an entirely community-driven initiative to put together a proposal to the Global Fund to do a variety of services, structured so as to flow funds at the lower level to specific organizations doing particular initiatives locally, but also coordinating things at a national level and drawing upon various experts as needed. So that was the first part of this puzzle. The second half of it was a complementary technical assistance program, which is what I'm going to present on. And I wanted to present the Global Fund supported program first because the purpose of the technical assistance program was to strengthen what the Global Fund had already committed to providing. And this was to be technical assistance focused specifically on addressing human rights issues, building up the human rights capacity of key populations, and creating partnerships to support them in claiming rights where needed and get access to services. So it consisted of 9 lawyers, including Mikhail, my colleague, whose work this is, 4 community coordinators who were drawn from each of the key populations. We based the approach to the work on a handbook that we developed with and for UNDP on knowing your rights and how to use the available legal tools that you may have in your jurisdiction to protect those rights and gain access to services. There were a number of training videos that were developed to accompany that handbook to make it more user-friendly in some ways and more accessible in different formats. And we developed a monitoring and evaluation framework. And this is important because a lot of time actually went into developing this framework because it's a little bit different in some ways than monitoring and evaluating HIV services, for example. This is a different kind of service. And we were trying to measure more advocacy intervention. The goals were to actually, as I say, create partnerships between lawyers and key populations to build the capacity and sense of empowerment of key populations to demand their rights and to achieve legal protection for people in reality. So there's a it's a fairly obvious kind of methodology, if you will, for those of us who think about doing human rights advocacy, and certainly those of us who are lawyers who think about doing human rights advocacy. But it's not really rocket science. There's some steps or an algorithm that you should go through, documenting a case where someone has experienced some sort of human rights violation or potential human rights violation that is affecting their health and welfare. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. Developing some partnerships with key sources of support, whether it's UN agencies, local health officials, local service providers of various sorts, lawyers, obviously, where that may be needed. There's then an attempt, if possible, to try to resolve the problem that the person has experienced, really at the lowest, most proximate level. Because obviously getting to a solution faster of the barrier that the person has encountered or the problem that they're having is good for them. But if that's not possible, then of course some sort of formal complaint procedure, which will vary depending on the institution or service provider that you might be having the issue with. And in Russia, there is actually a fairly well-developed and quite common set of arrangements that with any sort of governmental body, for example, there will be some basis in law to actually file a complaint, challenge a certain decision, and seek some sort of formal response from them. If that does not succeed in resolving the matter satisfactorily, then in some cases one can have recourse to the courts where the law provides some sort of basis to do that. In some cases, and I'm going to come back to this at the end, you may be able to proceed beyond that, having exhausted the remedies that in theory may be available to you domestically. You may turn to international human rights mechanisms and procedures to seek some sort of redress. And then, of course, there needs to be an attempt to follow through. If you succeed in getting some sort of commitment or decision to address the problem, you need to make sure that whoever it is that is in the position to affect that change, in fact, affects that change. So we designed a limited number, to keep it manageable, of indicators, both quantitative and qualitative, about this particular technical assistance program that would connect people through these community coordinators to community legal workers and to lawyers where needed in order to try to advocate for some sort of resolution to the human rights problem that they were facing. And the quantitative indicators you can see here on the screen were fairly basic, trying to keep track of the number of documented, and by this I mean fully and rigorously documented cases where someone from one of the key populations had identified a problem, the number of people who then received some sort of help from a community legal worker in trying to address that problem, the number of complaints that were ultimately filed in those cases to seek some sort of remedy or protection of their rights, and the number of state officials who were engaged. And there were qualitative indicators to assess the degree to which the goals of empowering people to feel that they could demand their rights happened. So here are the data quantitatively about the cases that were done, the people who received help, complaints filed, and so on. And we came close to documenting rigorously the number of cases we had hoped to, but in fact, if you look at the second line, a substantial number of people received help from community legal workers, well beyond the target of what we had hoped for. It's just that not all of those cases were documented as rigorously as they might have been. And we wanted to make sure to count as documented cases only those that were fully properly documented. We'd only anticipated filing a relatively small number of formal complaints, but you can see there was a vast number of formal complaints that ended up being filed, which piece of evidence I think is useful in identifying to funders, for example, to decision makers, that there is in fact an ongoing widespread systemic problem of people encountering human rights barriers to getting the health services they need or experiencing human rights violations in other ways that affect their health. And many positive outcomes. We hadn't set a particular target for that one, but we just wanted to track how many positive outcomes were achieved. I'm going to skip over the last two in the interest of time. And the qualitative indicators were gathered through surveys and key informant interviews, generally indicating that people felt better equipped to understand the law, to have a sense of what to do if they encountered a problem, what sort of legal remedies might be available to them. So these are the most common issues that the different key populations encountered. I won't go through all of them, but just to give you a flavor of the kinds of problems people needed legal help with. You can see, obviously, how some of them would affect access to services. And then the last thing I just want to say is that obviously the criminalization of key populations is the underlying substratum that gives rise to so many of these human rights violations of the sort that I just put up on the screen, including police abuse, discrimination in health services, violations of privacy, and so on. One thing to note is that this TA program actually also led to the incorporation of human rights related indicators into the Global Fund, the pre-existing Global Fund grant, which had not really been fully fleshed out before, and I think that's an important outcome as well. Key conclusions are you need to have easy access, ongoing access to this kind of technical assistance, and if you do have that, members of key populations can in fact be very effective advocates for their own human rights, including using legal or quasi-legal mechanisms, and where things start to get more complicated, having access to lawyers to back them up is hugely important. Now the next step, I just want to note, is we want to build on this with expanding, along with our partner organization, Humanitarian Action in St. Petersburg, an expanded combination of harm reduction services with community legal worker services there, specifically for people who use drugs. And I just wanted to acknowledge the funding that the Elton John AIDS Foundation is providing for that project, which is underway. Those are some acknowledgements, and if you'd like more information, here's my colleague's contact information, and you can look on our website. I also have some copies of the full evaluation report here, so please take them if you're interested. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard, for this very important presentation, especially taking into account the situation with HIV epidemic in Russia and attitude to key populations in this country, which constantly experience stigma discrimination, especially from governmental facilities. And I want to present the next speaker, Marlon Thompson from Jamaica. Marlon has been the shared incident database coordinator with the CVC coalition for over 3 years, but served in other capacities for 2 years as well. Among his many duties, he coordinates and facilitates training sessions around shared incident database, gender, HIV/AIDS, human rights, and advocacy. Marlon, welcome.
Good day. I want to thank the International AIDS 2018 for giving me this opportunity to share some of the work being done by CVC. So I'll just start off by just giving a quick overview of who CVC is. CVC, Caribbean Vulnerable Communities Coalition, is a coalition of frontline activists working with and on behalf of key populations around English, Dutch, French, and Spanish-speaking Caribbean. And we do work around HIV and human rights. So in 2005, CVC, along with Jamaica AIDS Support for Life, JFLAG, Jamaica Network of Seropositive, and Jamaica Network of Seropositive sat together and came together with the goal of how can we improve the human rights documentation framework in the region, and that's how the shared incident database was developed. They wanted something that they wanted a mechanism that could synchronize how persons are documenting rights violation. Because one of the challenges was that when it comes on to collaborating on the data, it was a little bit difficult because all the CSOs were documenting differently. So when it came on to collaborating, it was a little bit difficult. They also wanted a framework which helped to improve the culture of rights reporting, because if persons were not reporting rights violations in the region because they felt like nothing was being done, and we wanted a framework which documents and follows through on the redress component whenever it is needed. So that led to the Caribbean Civil Society Shared Incident Database, which is the first CSO-led human rights documentation framework in the Caribbean. It supports and strengthens evidence base because it generates reports to support these evidence-based advocacy initiatives. It enables comprehensive data collection to support redress. A part of the challenge we were addressing is that those who were documenting rights violation wasn't collecting enough information should it move on to legal redress per se, or even advance to a meeting, because it wasn't, the data that was being collected wasn't very comprehensive. So the shared incident database was developed with that in mind, as well as we know that if we, with building a system with a comprehensive documentation framework, it would help to build the capacity of CSOs when it comes on to documenting rights violation. And this was a system that was that is built to broker dialogue between CSOs and duty bearers. And that's why only civil society entities currently document rights violation on the shared incident database around the region. And it helps the CSOs in reporting upwards to the national bodies as well as some of the international and regional reporting bodies. So CSOs document rights violations in silo because of confidentiality reasons. However, non-identifying aggregate data get fed up to a global level, as well as CSOs are able to share that with other CSOs to do trend analysis and comparative analysis. The database is governed by a steering committee. The steering committee is made up of 15 members, which are expert members as well as user members. For the user members, we try to make sure that those user members are diversified based on geographic location as well as population served, so as to increase the wealth of knowledge that the steering committee has. And the steering committee provides technical assistance and guidance on how to move forward with the database. It also validates cases that are flagged for strategic litigation. Another key feature of the database is that it is web-based. One of the things persons wanted was that they wanted to be able to document in real time, because failure to do so, then the client might lose interest. So if I'm able to engage a sex worker in the field and document the rights violation, that would be a plus. So that's a plus for the system. And a unique feature of the system is that, so there are 6 categories that once those 6 categories line up to be exactly the same, the database will flag to the database administrator that, hey, this is a possible duplicate, and that will lead the steering committee to investigate with the CSOs, because we know that persons document rights violations wherever they seek services, and right now in the region we don't have a comprehensive service site. Persons seek services at different points and different CSOs. Progress to date. So since the database went live in 2016, we've managed to get 28 users on board documenting rights violations in those 8 countries: Jamaica, Guyana, Suriname, Belize, Dominican Republic, Haiti, St. Lucia, and Barbados. And we felt like that's a huge task because it increases our reach. And we're constantly sensitizing other persons so as to get more user members on board, because we want it to be the source of human rights information for the region when it comes down to civil society. Since it went live in 2016, we have documented over 125 cases. Those 1,425 cases. Those 1,425 cases are cases that have been validated, meaning that we've gone in to make sure it is documented correctly. All the information needed are in place so that we can move forward. We are currently in the process of doing an analysis, and the draft analysis of all the cases that have been documented so far have revealed that the majority of the cases documented involves physical violence, breach of confidentiality, denied access to health care, forced to leave job, and discrimination by relatives. A part of the feature of the database, while the database is a human rights monitoring mechanism, it is linked to some redress opportunities. One is the community paralegal. These are community members who we have trained, provided with materials so that they themselves can go back and provide this information to their communities in country. As well as the Carabona lawyers. This is a panel of lawyers which is coordinated by the University of the West Indies Rights Advocacy Project. And these lawyers have been sensitized to key population issues and have committed to providing pro bono services. To date, these pro bono lawyers have taken on 5 cases that are currently before the courts. One of the success stories is New Amsterdam is a community in rural Guyana. There isn't any known client complaint mechanism in place, and one of the user members on the database, Comforting Hearts, have engaged hospital authorities, clinical authorities, sensitized them to the shared incident database, and have developed a relation where every month or every other month they will have a meeting with these healthcare officials to let them know what the issues are, and so that they can work together in addressing them collectively. The sustainable piece, it is low cost to maintain the database. It supports evidence base. It supports efficient utilization of resources, because with the data, the reports that are generated, you're able to pinpoint where the issues are happening and what type of issues is happening in that space, so that you're able to tailor your interventions accordingly. It generates reports to support trend analysis, which can contribute to impact, which will help CSOs to measure impact. It generates rich data for program planning, and it supports CSOs' capacity to document rights violation. And it's a good tool to help to broker dialogue between CSOs and duty bearer. Next step for us in the database is we're looking in the database for cases that we can use for strategic litigation to help to improve the legal enabling environment for key population. And to have more CSOs. We'd love for every country, every CSO in the region to be documenting rights violation on the database. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Yes, it is very important for documenting human rights violation that will further strengthen our HIV responses. With that note, let me invite the next speaker, Mr. Madhusudana Bhatla from India. He works as a senior program officer at the Population Council Office in New Delhi, India, has immense research experience in the field of HIV, STI, gender-based violence, family planning, and RCH issues. Community mobilization, monitoring large-scale surveys, and impact evaluations are the areas of interest. Mr. Madhusudana.
Thank you, organizers, for giving me this opportunity to present at the Global Forum. I'll be talking about strengthening of HIV-related community organization and evidence from large-scale program in India. Government of India started HIV targeted intervention programs in early 1990 to address the HIV-related issues among high-risk group population, especially female sex workers, MSMs, transgenders, and injecting drug users throughout the country. After a decade of implementation of these government-targeted intervention programs, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation supported Indian government to implement the targeted intervention program across 6 high prevalence states in India. With this, Gates Foundation has signed a memorandum of agreement with the Government of India committing funding for throughout the prevention programs and also for the period of 5 years in its first phase, with the transition planning of these interventions to the government at the end of the first phase. So what the program has focused in the first phase of intervention is the basic HIV prevention services, including IEC, BCC, condom promotion, behavioral change, treatment care, and support. The program was tremendously successful by the end of the phase 1. What happened next? The civil society started questioning. The efforts are going to be sustained further, so what it should be done? Then the program had to relook, and then it has been upscaled to its second phase from leaving the peer-led targeted interventions to community mobilization-led intervention programs to provide basic HIV prevention services. Thus, the program focused community mobilization aspects where they started forming community-based groups at microsite level, at hotspot level. Further, these community-based group representatives democratically elected board members to form a society or community-based organization at a targeted intervention level, which approximately catering the services to 1,000 to 1,200 key populations at the TA program level. What happened next? The phase 2 program was tremendously successful again. It could able to form more than 100 community-based organizations which could able to sustain nearly 100 COs by end of phase 3. Now the question has come, what will happen to these community organizations if the funding stopped? Is it the only concept to address only HIV prevention services? Is there anything to do further? Yes, there is a lot. No doubt the HIV prevalence contained by these 2 programs, but there are lot more to provide services towards these key populations, such as to address their vulnerabilities, social protection, financial security. The redressal of crisis mechanism needs to be strengthened. Hence, the program entered to its 3rd phase, aiming to strengthen the community organizations in order to make the program sustainable despite even the funding stops over the program. Thus, the Avahan Phase 3 program entered into 3rd phase, aiming to address the key 4 program pillars: organizational development at the organizational level, and financial security, social protection, and crisis response at individual. Cumulatively, all these 4 program pillars, once they are addressed, it results into the sustained safe sex behavior among all key populations. Here, we try to understand what extent this organizational development has been strengthened the community-based organizations. So let me stress the organizational development pillar aims to strengthen the community-based organization by enhancing its governance, its management skills and program monitoring and as well as financial management, in addition to strengthening advocacy and networking mechanisms. So what activities were done to strengthen these areas? Leadership training was given for whom? Not only to the CO staff, but also to the key board members of the organization who were very crucial and instrumental in forming the community-based organizations. Skill building workshops at regular interventions were given to key selected members within the organization. The system of periodic assessment across all domains, the functionaries of the organization was well set up. Resource mobilization mechanism was strengthened. All the COs were trained, oriented, and then enhanced their skills to conduct various activities to mobilize the resources. And the program also focused to enhance a formal engagement with other like-minded organizations, including various departments of government, non-governmental organizations, and other community-based organizations which are similar to them. So, how to measure these community strength? What has been the progress in the CO strength over a time by the end of the program, and on which areas the CO change occurred, and what program ingredients helped in change of organizational strength? So we have considered the data that has been collected at 2 rounds as a part of the Avahan evaluation program. The data was collected at 2 points of time, baseline in 2015 and endline in 2017. A total of 87 organizations were given the program, and we have retained the 48 community-based organizations which took part in both the rounds of the surveys. And the program focused the selected 48 organizations spread across 5 Indian states. And what we did like interviews with the CO managers and key leaders by using structured questionnaires to substantiate the responses. To some extent, we have reviewed the registers and documents maintained by the community organizations. We have conducted panel data analysis and then decomposition analysis to understand the results. So why we need to define a CO strength? What is the need to understand this? Because the CO strength is the key indicator to understand what extent the COs are performing and what extent the CO is performing at the different domains of sustainable components of the community organization. Thus, we consider 6 major dimensions to measure the CO strength, like governance, project management, financial management, advocacy, resource mobilization, and program MIS. All these 6 dimensions were given equal weightage, and all these 6 dimensions consist of 32 key specific indicators, and each indicator within each dimension were also given equal weightage while computing this measure. Further, in consultation with the community-based organizations, the program implementing agency, and the earlier literature review extensively done on the earlier phases of the Avahan program implementation, we further categorized the strength of the CO into 3 categories. One is foundation, where the COs needs more support to implement the program, also to handle the programs independently. The another one is to implement the program where COs could able to perform but can able to independently, and the vibrant stage which are already able to do that. As a result, the CO strength, if you look at most of the COs which were in foundation and promising stage entered into the vibrant stage at end line. And by looking at the characteristics, size of the CO matters a lot rather than other characteristics of the CO. When we deep dived into understand further the strength, resource mobilization, advocacy networking, and governance played a crucial role for the positive change in the CO strength. With this, the other components that helped in increasing the CO strength are availability of the seed fund at the initiation of the program, increase of the community ownership and the membership over a period of time, setting up of unified help desk to cater the services of the key population, better networking strategies, and ability to mobilize resources, and finally the motivation of the CO leaders. With this, the corpus fund has increased over time from baseline to end line, whereas if you look at the corpus fund within the foundation level has declined. Probably this could be because the community organizations started spending the corpus fund within the period of thing at the foundation level. But the COs which were performing at the promising level and the vibrant level during the baseline has tremendously increased. Similarly, on an average, $3,600 were generated by COs by various income generating activities implemented by the community-based organizations. So most of these income generative activities have come from through donations, annual membership fees, and the events conducted during various celebration of the events on the various occasions. Thus, the study suggests that intervention to strengthen key population-led CO showed significant improvement in the strength, providing an alternative to NGO structure for sustaining HIV risk reduction, especially in countries like in India. Though the COs were vibrant at the end line, their ability to generate more funds to sustain organizations is critical to their sustainability. Going forward, COs need further nurturing around the fund mobilization to make organizations more sustainable. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Dr. Batala, for a very informative presentation. And now I would like to invite our final speaker. It's Dr. Diana Kerrigan, who is a professor of sociology and director of the Center of Health, Risk and Society at American University in Washington, D.C., and she also is an adjunct professor of health, behavior and society at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and her research focuses on understanding and addressing social and structural factors affecting the health and HIV risk of underserved populations. Please.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today on behalf of our study team findings from our recently completed phase 2 trial of Project Shakaama. Shakaama means let's stick together in Swahili, and it is a community empowerment-based model of combination HIV prevention, and we sought to evaluate its impact on both HIV outcomes and sexual and reproductive health outcomes. I would start by reminding everyone of the significantly heightened risk for HIV infection that female sex workers face across settings. The most recent data we have from an updated systematic review and meta-analysis shows that the HIV prevalence among sex workers is 10.4% globally. However, when we look regionally, we can see that the highest regional HIV prevalence among sex workers is sub-Saharan Africa, and the prevalence is currently at 33.3%. In Tanzania, our study setting, we observe a 26.6% prevalence among female sex workers compared to a 6.2% prevalence among adult women overall. The significantly heightened risk for HIV that female sex workers face is set within a setting, a context of powerful structural and social constraints. And these include laws and policies which criminalize sex work, gender inequality, and poverty. It also includes multiple forms of intersecting stigma and discrimination and violence, including stigma related to sex work as an occupation, gender, socioeconomic status, and also HIV status. Community empowerment is an approach by which sex workers take collective ownership of programs and services and guide and tailor these services to meet their needs and their realities, their priorities. And really, it sits at the center of the HIV response, as is depicted here in this figure, which comes from the sex worker implementation tool that our first speaker spoke about in detail, where we see it really creates synergy and connects these different services and components, whether they be biomedical, behavioral, or structural. We conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis of community empowerment approaches to HIV among sex workers in 2015 and found a 32% reduction in the odds of HIV infection among sex workers in those who were exposed to community empowerment programming. And these were generally comprehensive or combination-based responses with a community empowerment approach. However, we found no rigorous evaluations of community empowerment-based combination HIV prevention models in sub-Saharan Africa. And this really set the stage for the current study, where our specific aims were to assess the feasibility and acceptability of a community empowerment model of combination prevention among sex workers, female sex workers in Iringa, Tanzania, to establish the preliminary effects of that model on HIV incidence and viral suppression, and to explore pathways and mechanisms of effect. The study took place in the Iringa region of Tanzania, which is set 500 kilometers southwest of Dar es Salaam, and it has the highest HIV prevalence in the country, currently at 11.3%. The Tanzam Highway bifurcates the region and stimulates much mobility, migration, seasonal work in the region, and what we see is that that in turn creates and facilitates a demand for female sex work. We started conducting formative research, qualitative research in 2011 to understand the needs and realities of sex workers in Iringa, and what we found was very limited tailored services to their needs, and in particular, limited attention to social and structural factors like stigma, discrimination, and violence. We did see positive examples of community organizing, peer support, and that was really the foundation upon which Project Shakaama was built. The design of our evaluation was a community randomized controlled trial. We established a cohort of 496 female sex workers, 203 of which were HIV positive, 293 of which were HIV negative, from 2 communities which were matched on both size and HIV risk characteristics. Sex workers were recruited using time-location sampling from venues where sex work occurred in the region, including bars, brothels, clubs, discos. At each study visit, baseline and 18 months, we surveyed participants and drew blood to assess HIV status as well as viral load among the positives. We achieved an 81.5% retention rate over this 18-month period. And our primary biological outcomes of interest were incident HIV infection and viral suppression. We also conducted in-depth interviews with 24 sex workers and 16 key informants to gain their insight into the implementation process. In terms of our data analysis, our approach was basically an intent-to-treat approach. We used Poisson regression to establish relative rates and key outcomes across study arms. And at 18-month follow-up, we compared the rates of HIV incidence across arms, and we also adjusted for missing outcomes using inverse probability weighting. We looked at follow-up also at use of family planning, and we compared baseline to follow-up rates for outcomes such as consistent condom use, the HIV Care Continuum, and gender-based violence. Our sample was relatively young, mostly in their 20s, with low levels of education. Most were moms. On average, they had 2 children. Their mean number of clients per week were 4. At baseline, there was an HIV prevalence in the sample of 40.9%, and about half had been previously exposed to gender-based violence sometime in their life. The intervention had multiple components. Really at the center was this idea of sex workers at the center of the response. There was a drop-in center which created a safe space and an opportunity to stimulate social cohesion and community mobilization in the sex worker community. There were quarterly workshops held, but the sex workers then had an opportunity to brainstorm and think about other activities and events that they wanted to hold at the drop-in center. A cadre of 10 peer educator, peer navigators was trained and formed, and these women went into the venues to conduct health education, distribute condoms, facilitate HIV testing, and they also help women who tested positive, link them to care, and help retain them in care by providing social support. There were quarterly trainings, sensitivity trainings of HIV clinical care providers, and we utilized SMS messaging to help remind people to engage with the intervention, where the services were located, and also ART adherence reminders for those who are living with HIV. I would note that at the time of study implementation, PrEP was not yet available through the public health system, so this was not part of the package at that stage. So moving to our findings, one of our most salient findings was the impact of the intervention at follow-up on HIV incidence. So as you can see in the graph here, HIV incidence was significantly lower in the intervention versus control community. So it was about 5% incidence rate at follow-up compared to 10.4% at follow-up in the control community. And that was statistically significant. Looking at condom use, specifically consistent condom use across both new and regular clients in the last month, we see significant changes in a positive direction in the intervention community with consistent use with both client types moving from 24.6% to 36.1% over the 18-month period, but remaining relatively stable during that same period in the control community at 28%. These figures show the HIV Care Continuum for each study community between baseline and follow-up. And what you can see is that there are improvements in both the intervention and control communities. However, there are significant improvements if you compare the rates at follow-up between the intervention, in the intervention community specifically as compared to the control community. And so here below the graphs you can see an example of some of the aspects of the care continuum in terms of engagement in care, being on ART, and ART adherence, all of which were significant in terms of being higher within the intervention community at follow-up compared to the control community. The one outcome we saw remain relatively stable was viral suppression. We saw a positive trend in the intervention community, but not a statistically significant difference. We did see more substantive differences when we examined who was able to remain virally suppressed among those who were already suppressed at baseline in the intervention community. We also looked at other sexual and reproductive health outcomes beyond HIV. We saw, for example, at follow-up, higher use of modern family planning methods in the intervention community compared to the control. And we saw significant reductions of gender-based violence, both physical and sexual, in the last 6 months in the intervention community specifically. So the level of gender-based violence went from 42.6% to 34.1% in the intervention community. And we can really attribute this to the mobilization of the sex worker community in the intervention arm, where they were able to form their own violence support group, prevention and support group, and conduct workshops around violence in the drop-in center. They also developed educational materials in conjunction with the local artists and developed tip cards that women could put in their pocket and remind them of safety tips to try and prevent GBV in the workplace. And there was also training of local police and gender desk officers to try and sensitize them to the needs and realities of sex workers. I'd just like to also highlight the leadership of the Shakaama project, the women who participated in Project Shakaama. During the course of the intervention, they formed their own group, and they're looking now to register that group to be able to sustain an organization over time that can create leadership and continue with the activities that were stimulated under this initial study. They've also formed a community savings group, which gives loans and helps stimulate businesses among the women. And one of the businesses that was developed, a catering business, actually a portion of those profits now go back to the activities of the project to be able to sustain things like peer education post-study end. So this is one of the first trials of a community empowerment-based combination HIV prevention model in sub-Saharan Africa, specifically tailored to the needs of female sex workers. We saw significant effects on HIV incidence and multiple aspects of the care continuum. We did observe challenges increasing viral suppression over the initial study period, but we did also see a broader impact beyond HIV on sexual and reproductive health outcomes utilizing this community empowerment approach, and in particular on GBV. Our next steps would be to test the effectiveness of Project Shakaama at a larger scale within the confines perhaps of a phase 3 trial, randomized trial, to integrate newer technologies such as self-testing and PrEP, intensify ART and PrEP adherence strategies given some of the challenges that we saw sustaining viral suppression, and also to explore cost effectiveness of the model to inform both equitable and strategic investments for key populations. Ultimately, it's very important to the whole study team that we're able to continue to support female sex worker leadership, capacity, and organizational development as the model moves forward and hopefully could be adapted to other settings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dina. Indeed, today it was really surprising to see globally FSW prevalence is 10.4%. And that is why it is indeed very important that we empower key populations if we want to have a if we want to have a reduction in HIV. With that note, a huge round of applause for our speakers. They were really indeed very intense, very beautiful. Thank you so much. We now open the floor for question answers. If you have any questions to our speakers, to our panelists, please come on these mics over here.
Anyone? Okay. The gentleman, please.
Well, thank you very much to all the panelists for the very excellent presentations. My name is Dr. Samson Kironde. I do come from Uganda and work with the University Research Company. My question is to the last presenter, that's I think Dr. Dina, and it basically deals with the whole issues that we do have around in many countries in Africa and elsewhere of essentially this group of people, key population, sex workers being harassed, criminalized, not recognized, and therefore it becomes very, very hard to do many of the interventions that you've been talking about simply because the situation or environment that they work in is really very hostile, and many of them actually have to do it underground and not overtly, otherwise they get into trouble, or alternatively they've got to be in cahoots with the police and other security services to be able to actually practice their trade, if I may put it that way, which eventually means that many of the interventions that you have discussed with us may actually not be things that they could be able to take on or realize appropriately for them to be able to, reduce the incidence of HIV, like you have said, as well as to be able to have an impact overall in this very, very key population. So my question or my really comments after my comments is that in Iringa district, did you find that this was a very big issue that did impact on the way interventions were taken up either in the control or in the intervention group? Thank you.
Thank you for that.
And maybe I suggest we take the second question, and if there are no more questions, then we'll proceed with responding.
Great, thank you. Hi, Joanne Keatley from Innovative Response Globally for Trans Women and HIV, the IRGT. My question to the panelists is that I know that some of you have been very inclusive of all the key populations, and your presentations reflected that. And so I really appreciated that when that happened. But some of you spoke about key populations and referenced key populations without also mentioning specifically and referencing transgender individuals. And I think that that's a disservice sometimes when key populations are reduced to certain populations among the key populations. I think that we need to be very mindful. I don't mean to lecture the panelists, but I think that every time that we reduce key population terminology to only mean MSM or only mean female sex workers, I think that then that does a disservice to the rest of the key populations. We need to be mindful of who we're speaking about when we're referring to key populations. I'm going to ask the panelists to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment. And if there are any more questions by now, then probably I will ask Dr. Kerrigan to respond to the first question, and then maybe anyone would like to comment on the second one.
Thank you for that question. First, I would acknowledge the fact that context matters, and what might be feasible and possible in one context in a given political moment may vary greatly. I would say that we worked very closely with our partners from Muhimbili University as well as governmental partners in Tanzania, to first establish the fact that the approach we were taking, the community empowerment approach, is something that is part of the key population guidelines put out by WHO that had been really appreciated and adopted by the public health community in Tanzania. And so that was our starting point, that we were on the same page in terms of the guidelines and the framework for this work. And then at a regional level in Iringa, it was very important to start the project with dialogue not only within the sex worker community, but with those other partners such as government officials, clinicians, the police, other strategic actors that were influencing the HIV risk environment for female sex workers. So really, I think it was the community allowing us to understand where they wanted to be focusing and looking for strategic openings that were culturally and politically appropriate, and taking the lead from the sex worker community rather than taking a model that might have been used elsewhere and just trying to run with it without attention to that context.
Thank you. Any reflections on the second comment?
Thank you for that intervention. I take the point. It's really important, so thank you for making that point. In the specific case that I was referring to, of course, it was key populations who organized themselves and were part of the Global Fund grant, and there wasn't a separate trans organizing of key populations, although certainly there would have been trans women and men among sex worker, and possibly some overlap with the group that was labeled as MSM. But I think your point is well taken, so thanks for that.
Thank you. Do you have any more comments from the audience? Because we still have like five minutes. If not, maybe I have one more question for Robin. Those recommendations you have developed and presented today, I just wonder if you evaluated like how these recommendations are being implemented in practice by your partners in those countries, and do they help to like to fix the situation?
No, it doesn't start. Sorry.
Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate that question. And I don't know if you recall, I know everybody's seen 1,000 slides in the last 4 days, but one of the slides mentioned that it's incredibly important to have a proactive and an approach prior to acute violence breaking out. So I can kind of answer your question from two perspectives. One is that we've been, and so this is that toolkit that I was showing. All of our documents look very similar, but the toolkit is thicker and it has tools within it that include checklists so that all of our partners are able to really look at what they themselves are doing. And so we have 130 CBOs worldwide that we work with, and so far 80 of them have completed this. We're working with the remaining 50 to complete. But they go through and they tell us where their gaps are, and then we've been working with them to fill those gaps. Because the thought is that no matter what your security issues that are happening right now, obviously if things get worse, it's preferable to advance those before things get worse. So that's really been the project-wide investment that we've made right now. But then the other piece is in countries where we anticipate violence, where we kind of have a sense from media or upcoming laws that violence is going to occur, we have started to do that coordinating work with our other partners, with UN agencies to say, do some of the planning in advance around who would do what if things really, take a turn, if they go from bad to worse. And so I can't say, that we've kind of intervened in a situation where acute violence was already occurring, but we have both put measures in place to be proactive in terms of in chronic situations of violence, but then also in those that we anticipate might soon become more intense.
Okay, thank you so much. And just to remind that you can grab this document presented by Robin from the stage after the session. So if there are no more comments, I would like to ask my colleague Simran, co-chair, to close the session.
Thank you, Ivan. Yes, I think it was such a beautiful panel with beautiful audience. And I pick up the lines from all the speakers, the catchy lines, what do we do? And it is a simple answer. invest in community, and community consists of all key population. Many of this study resembles investing on community-based organization, strengthening them gives beautiful results, holds on. There are examples how they sustain, how they build up their corpuses. It's time, when the funding are drying, it's time to rethink how we can design community interventions specific towards system strengthening. With that note, thank you so much. A big, huge round of applause for each and everyone present in this room. Thank you.